All right, hello everybody, or as Chris would say, hello friends.
Hey.
This is episode 6 of Student Questions. So if you're unfamiliar with it, hello, welcome. In this type of lesson, Chris and I take some of the questions that we take the questions that we have either been asked directly or questions that we've seen across the internet as we're interacting with guitar content. Some of them seem kind of like, really, people are asking that, but I think especially with beginner guitar students, no question is invalid because everybody has a different journey. So Chris might argue with me on that, but everybody comes at it in their own way, and some of these are just kind of fun softballs to ask Chris. So yeah. So question 1, and this might just be an opinion for Chris to go on about, but what are the best acoustic strings for fingerpicking?
Ooh, that's a great question. The key when you're starting with acoustic strings and learning to use your fingers is to make sure you're using light gauge strings and that your guitar is, most importantly, your guitar is set up for those light gauge strings. A lot of guitars are kind of generally set up for kind of medium strings on a steel string acoustic. And with the help of a luthier, in 20 minutes, you can get your guitar set up to play really easily with light gauge strings, and that's going to allow you to play the longest at first. As you build some stamina and endurance and hand strength, you can move into using some heavier gauge strings, which what we mean by heavy and light is the thickness of the string and how it feels on your left hand when you're pressing it down, and the resistance it gives your right hand while you're plucking. So with the light gauge strings, we've got lower resistance on both fronts. They're easier to pluck and they're easier to press down, which is in turn going to allow you to play longer. And the heavier gauge strings, the benefit of that is they create more volume. But until you master your technique and have the endurance and knowledge to dig in a little bit more with the guidance of a good teacher, you're going to want to use the light gauge strings just in order to be able to play comfortably. So seek out some light gauge strings and a good guitar tech. There's a great guitar tech in every city in the country, and almost every city in the world. There's somebody who that's what they love doing, is wrenching on guitars, setting up the necks, setting up the bridges, and making it a comfortable experience. You can have moderate, to inexpensive guitar, and if it's set up properly, it can be just absolutely a dream to play as a beginner. And then you can upgrade into higher end equipment as you go on. But proper setup and light gauge strings, you'll be able to play for a while.
Yeah. Now, I will say with setup stuff, if you're interested in learning about that, Gibson has a whole series that they're doing on their YouTube channel with their master luthier for their Gibson custom shop down in Nashville, and he walks you through the Gibson approach on how to set things up and do things there. And then, have you been to the Stu Mac site recently?
Not recently, but I've definitely seen a lot of Dan's videos on there. He's just, you can go down a rabbit hole of hours watching
Oh yeah.
restore all these vintage instruments.
Yeah, so again, if you're unfamiliar, Stu Mac is basically where all the luthiers buy, their stuff, or people interested in getting started in luthier stuff. There's a great selection that Stu Mac has on those things, and they have a whole bunch of stuff on their blog on, how do I fix a rusty bridge to, fixing the nut or string buzz, all that kind of stuff. Now, a follow up for you, because on acoustic, for me, I use 10s or 11s.
And that's pretty
Yeah.
light. So.
And I've noticed that on the different string packs, the acoustic light gauge tends to be slightly different than the electric light. Because, with electric guitars, you'd usually think like 9s would be the light gauge string. Does that ring true since you're buying more acoustic packs than I am.
Yeah. Well, the big difference is in your bass strings there too.
Mhm.
So a light gauge set of acoustic strings is going to have a slightly thicker fourth, fifth, and sixth string than on the electric pack. Like a set of tens, you might have a 0.46 or a 0.48 for your bottom E, which is pretty light. If you put that on an acoustic, it just doesn't stay in tune as well. So a lot of the acoustics will, even in a light gauge set, will go up to like 0.52, which is pretty heavy. You know, if you were going to have that on an electric, you'd really feel the resistance, and you'd probably need some adjustment at the nut to get the string to fit the guitar properly on an electric, whereas acoustics are pretty much set to manage that gauge right off the bat.
Interesting. And is there any real difference with light gauge steel string versus classical?
Oh yeah, massive difference. Classical strings are the most comfortable and lightest type of string you could possibly play. Now, if you put classical strings on an acoustic guitar, generally you're going to get a ton of buzz because the guitar is just improperly set. Classical strings belong on what we call a nylon or folk style guitar, and steel strings belong on a steel string acoustic guitar meant to, you know, manage the stress on the top of the instrument with the steel strings. So never ever put steel strings of any kind on a classical guitar. And if you're going to put nylon strings on a steel string guitar, you need a massive adjustment from a luthier. It's better to just get a separate guitar, because the money you're going to spend getting a guitar set up, a steel string guitar set up to use classical strings, these days you can just get such an affordable nylon string option for you know, 150 bucks used, or $299 new for a really good sounding, you know, starter classical. You might as well just buy a classical guitar if you want to use nylon strings. But
well, that's any reason to get a new guitar, right?
That's right. Absolutely. They all have different tone colors. They all do different things, and you need them in your collection.
Exactly. That's why I have the stupid collection I have over here. Awesome. So actually, that's a good segue, because the second question we have is, you know, what should I learn first, acoustic or electric? And I know I've been asked this a bazillion times by student parents. And my answer is always, well, what do you have? You know, because so many people have, you know, grandpa's guitar in the closet, or, you know, my dad was in a band in high school, and you know, the Les Paul has just collected dust for 20 years, so I'm using his, right? But if you don't already have a guitar on hand, what would you recommend, or at least how do you approach that when you have students parents asking you that?
Yeah, you know, if there hasn't been a specific interest expressed, it's just guitar in general, I just recommend acoustic. You know, my personal preference is for beginners to start on an acoustic guitar, and particularly a classical nylon string guitar. It's just such a comfortable way to start. Your left hand experiences no, you know, extra effort. You're not going to fatigue your left hand unnecessarily by playing on classical strings. They're the lightest guitar possible, so they're easy to hold. Another big reason with children especially, I recommend starting with fractional size classical guitars and finding an experienced teacher who's good at working with young kids. The kids are going to be able to play longer. They're going to have great posture that'll translate over to different styles as they get older. And, you know, when people approach me with like a 6, 7, or 8-year-old, I always recommend starting with a classical guitar and doing some classical guitar studies, which develop both hands equally. And then as the kids get older, they can move into using a plectrum or guitar pick. That's the technical term, the plectrum, and buying an electric guitar as their body can handle it. Electric guitars, really, the smaller ones that they make, in my humble opinion, they don't sound good. And the bigger ones are heavy. They're just heavy. It's too much weight to put on a child. Usually the guitar weighs as much as they do. So,
especially when you look at some old Les Pauls, they're like boat anchors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I recommend the classical acoustic guitar just because it's so light and easy to play. And anything you can do on a classical, you can do on an electric later. Stuff you learn on an electric, you can't necessarily do on a classical, such as like string bends, idiomatic things to the different styles that you're playing. But yeah, total beginners, especially if they haven't expressed a preference, start on the acoustic and build that great foundation and that great dexterity between both the hands. Now, if you have like a 12 or 13-year-old who's just obsessed with punk rock and obsessed with a certain genre of music, generally their body's big enough to handle an electric guitar. And if that's all they're motivated to practice and learn, then you need to seek out a teacher who's great at playing that style and teaching it to kids too. You got to find the right combination of not only knowledge, but able to break down the pedagogy for kids to be successful in their step-by-step learning. And a child's probably going to have a great time learning how to play. There's a lot of kids who started as teenagers playing electric guitars who then later moved into the nuance and the dexterity necessary to play fingerstyle acoustic steel string or classical guitar. I mean, there's so many guitarists in the classical world who, this guy. There's so many guitarists in the classical world, especially who, they'll tell you that the guy who got them playing was Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix or, John Petrucci. And that's what motivated them to play in the first place for a couple of years. And then they just expanded. They just listening to guitar music. You're going to eventually down the road discover styles of guitar playing that you never knew existed, and you're going to be captivated by them. And that's the great thing about being a lifelong learner.
Well, I was reading an interview with Michael Ackerfeld, the lead singer of Opeth, and he started out on classical, which is one of the reasons Opeth sounds the way it does, because of all those open chords and his fingerstyle pieces. And then there's a lot of modern metal guys that are rediscovering classical guitar, not I think just as a timbral thing, but also as a nicer way of playing some stuff, which has been interesting to see. Tosin Abasi or
what I always point out to parents is, if you've got the time to just kind of to dive deep into it, is if you look at a shred guitar player like Steve Vai and an incredible classical guitar player like Berta Rojas or John Williams, the position of the guitar is exactly the same. The people who play electric guitar with great virtuosity and just flying left-hand fingers and a flying pick technique, the central body position, the angle of the neck, it's all universal. The thumb's back on the neck. They're just playing with great dexterity and mobility. One's on an electric, one's on a classical. So to achieve high levels of virtuosity, eventually you're focusing on the same types of technique and the same progress down that road of mastery at a really intricate level, that it doesn't matter if you're playing an Ibanez or you're playing a classical guitar, you're going to be focused on the same aspects of high-end technique, light finger touches, playing with minimal tension. Our whole phrase for mastery at the upper levels of virtuosity is economy of motion. We want everything our body does to yield the maximum result with the least amount of effort. And that's the focus of all high-end virtuosic music playing on any instrument.
I went the route of, I think a lot of people where, so much as schools still offer, band and music classes. I started on bass and did that for 3 years, learned guitar at home. But, that path was interesting because I think my left hand was already more developed than, kind of the typical beginner, just because I was doing the finger picking, at least from bass playing. But it led to some heavy hands. I'm not a soft touch player, unfortunately, from that. But so you brought this up, and it's actually the third question. So question 3 is, what's the best guitar pick for beginners? Now I know I have my own theories of that, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, one of my favorite picks for beginners is this brand, which I'm not mentioning specifically because we haven't gotten any kind of endorsements, but
Yeah.
this type of pick is made out of nylon. It has a very good sound on a multitude of strings. Steel, you don't use a plectrum on classical strings. So that's just kind of, we just don't really play classical strings with a pick. But steel strings of many varieties, this brand of pick, I'll just go ahead and say it's the Dunlop brand. They make a great nylon pick. Nylon is a great choice for pick. Acrylic is really harsh, really, really metallic sounding. There's not a lot of good sounding acrylic picks out there. And getting into the thickness, that's really the key you want to focus on as a beginner, is the thickness of the pick. And so it's measured in millimeters. And so this one in particular is a 0.73 millimeter. And they go lighter, down to 0.6 something, 0.5 something, and they go higher up to like 1.0, 1.2, 1.5, and thicker and heavier. And as a beginner, I'd recommend starting with something under 1.0. So start with, this is the heaviest pick I recommend for a beginner. It's 0.73 millimeters. And if you're strumming chords, I like using a 0.5 something very light. You'll be able to, flex it in between your fingers very easily. And it'll move through the strings, relatively smoothly, allowing you to play all the strings fully as you're working on big chords. When you're playing individual notes, scales, patterns like that, this slightly thicker pick drives the string. It pushes through the string a little bit more firmly, producing a better resonant tone from your guitar, whether it's electric or acoustic. It just helps the string to sing. We want to get that string moving and singing, and the thicker pick will drive that. When you want to get really heavy and do a lot of power chords, that's where the 1.0 millimeter, pick will come in handy. But starting with open chords and single string patterns, 0.7 and lighter, I just think is a great way to go. There's, just to nerd out on picks here, I saw that question and I grabbed a pick that I have by a guy in the US who makes these out of old vintage celluloid. So this is a celluloid pick. They used to, they were using celluloid, way back decades ago. And it just has a different sound. It's not definable until you hear it. And it sounds different on different types of strings. Like if I play with a celluloid pick on nickel electric guitar strings, it has a different sound than if I play with it on phosphor bronze steel acoustic strings. And it's just unique. It's just got a different kind of timbre, and it's kind of fun to have that. And picks are cheap. So, thickness, this is a 0.7 something as well. And you can just get a lot of different picks in that 0.7 or 0.5, and it'll literally cost you like $10 tops to get a ton of picks. Yeah.
This is my pick container. What does it say? Keep calm, Ray John. But yeah, I'll just say I've got a lot of the commemorative stuff, like throwaway thing. Like here's a Metallica, pick. I will say, doubling down on what you said previously, I've discovered that as for me, as I've gotten further down my journey, I have been going heavier with my picks. Partially because of the sound. Yep. So I'm using the Dunlop Jazz 3. But I was really trying not to just like totally, nerd out on Petrucci stuff. But his little shield ones are just like perfect for my feel, like the way that I like to play. But I have noticed, and this would be something to talk about too. I started out on, again, I was going to say the Dunlop Tortex. So this one is this, what was it? 0.88.
Yep.
I recommend this one to start out with because it's, now granted, I'm more on the rock side, so I deal with more electric players. At least I'm kind of assuming that. So yell at me if I'm being wrong.
I think I remember seeing James Hetfield say that if you cut open one of the Metallica albums and just bleed green Tortex picks because that was his favorite pick for so long.
Well, yeah, and when I was starting out and I was looking at, okay, what gear do all my favorite people use? Almost everyone at that time was using, these green ones. So I'm like, all right, that's at least someplace to start.
Right.
I do not like going, this is a personal preference. I don't like going lighter than this because of the thwappy sound it makes against the strings.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we say what's the best thing, well, again, you have to experiment. Mm-hmm. We can talk generally here, but you have to find your own likes and dislikes for the way that you want to play. I tend to be more of a technique geek, so I want that single note, mm-hmm. ring out more so than a lot of the strumming stuff. Size does matter as well. So here's the standard one versus this smaller jazz style. And yeah, I have fat fingers, so these just don't work for me. But if I had really skinny fingers, I would probably like them a lot more, yeah. So anyway, I think I'm up to, was it 1.15?
Oh, I thought you were at 1.5 with those.
I go back and forth, and actually this is an interesting thing maybe for people who want to nerd out, or maybe this will just be the point where everybody skips.
It'd be helpful if you bullet pointed that by telling people about your guitar. You're using an 8-string guitar with really heavy bass strings. You're doing a lot of low string rhythm keeping, and the thick pick is going to drive those immensely huge bass strings. Most people as they begin aren't going to play on anything nearly as hefty as what you're slinging around.
Right. Well, yeah. So what's funny? I have the 8-string, but I use it mostly like for really particular things. My main axe for years has been this one that I built with my dad. It's just a 7-string. It's a Carvin neck, which is now Kiesel guitars. But the body is all ours. These are the Steve I pickups. That you talk boat anchor, because this was home built. This thing is relegated to the studio now. I'm no longer gigging with this one, just because it is like, you start developing shoulder problems from holding onto it. But I do just a lot more single note stuff than a lot of other people. But I have noticed, so during the pandemic, I took the time to dive in and nerd out on picks, because I realized that the stuff that was working on my electrics wasn't working on my acoustics, and I couldn't play the way that I wanted to. So I tried out like all these sharp point ones, which I don't really like for the way that I play. Sometimes I do for like single note stuff, but strumming, the points just don't feel right to me. Have you ever used the pointed?
I have. I agree. For strumming large amounts of strings or 6-string chords, I don't enjoy the feel of it as well either. I like the more traditional rounded and beveled. In particular, thicker pick with beveled edges, can feel, you can get in. So that's the next step up in your pick purchase. You get a lot of these basic picks. They're cut, they're machine stamped. And then the next upgrade, you're going to pay a little bit more per pick, sometimes $2 a pick more, when you get a pick that has had a particular attention to the way the edge is shaped. It will be rounded and, very similar to like fine metal work, except they're doing it on, on the plastic material of the picks. And that gives a whole new experience to plucking single strings and strumming chords when you're playing with a beveled pick. So a lot of things to explore, but don't forget, the most important thing to focus on when you're a beginner is keeping rhythm. Rhythm's the most important thing, and just practicing your foundation. You got the rest of your life to continue to explore this, and definitely have fun doing so, but don't do it at the expense of your hard-earned and dedicated practice time.
Right. Yeah. So this is something that this next question, I've always wondered, but I've never actually brought up to you in person. So I'm just going to take the opportunity to do it. what is the deal with acoustic guitar players' fingernails?
Yeah.
So I know that they're, built-in picks basically, but what's the why behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the absolute fine control of your fingertip. It's that balance between the flesh at the tip of your finger and the way you shape your nail and the length of your nail. That combination of touching the string before the pluck with a combination of nail and flesh creates a specifically unique to you sound. Your hand sounds different than anybody else's hand, and you're going to get a really warm, beautiful sound off of the string by using your fingernails if they're shaped and buffed correctly. It's a multi-step process. That's a whole nother instructional video. And there's videos out there on nail care, but you have to get some length, and then you have to clean them up too. You have to buff them and file them so that they look like the edge of a guitar pick. You're essentially creating guitar picks on the end of your fingers, and it creates a tactile sensation with the string that it's just, there's nothing like it. It's the most connected to the instrument you can feel. And there are a lot of great electric guitar players who play with much shorter nails. They'll still have just a little bit of nail edge. Some have no nail edge, but there are an immense amount of incredible electric guitar players who just play with their fingers and rarely use a pick too. So the idea of connecting to your instrument with your right hand fingertips is universal. It's across the styles, not just steel string acoustic, not just nylon string classical, but vast.
A lot of really great blues players never touched a pick, but did the whole electric thing.
Yep, absolutely, a lot of them. So
nice. Well, so that's the questions we have for today. Anybody who's still with us, thank you. And this, I like this format. So please send in any questions, comments, so we could ask your question on one of these, and just to nerd out on these kind of things is fun, at least for me. So I'm having a good time.
Fun for all of us. Yeah. And there's no silly question. This is a place for beginners to feel comfortable asking anything they've wanted to know about the guitar. And sometimes it's hard to find an answer to a question you think would be, easy to find an answer to. And that's what we're here for, to be a resource for you and help you get those answers correctly from years of experience that we've got. We're here for you.
Right. Yeah. Especially with, some of these things, some of the internet sites where you go to ask a question and then you have all of the opinions of the community on you. Like, anything post Jimmy is just dumb. You're like, what? Who are you? Like, everybody can have their own thing. Like, yeah. So we're definitely not going to be that space. I will delete those comments because we don't want those kind of comments for anybody who's engaging with us. So anyway, long story long. Thank you. Like, subscribe, share, and we will see you next week with another lesson. And let us know what you think. Take care.